Hello and welcome to this video all about the basics of application architecture and the way that we structure the kind of coding logic behind each layer of the application. And these main bullet points that you're seeing here already, which are the database, the API, and the front end, are kind of the layers of the stack that people talk about when they talk about full stack development. Now, I am simplifying things a bit here. So each one of these layers also has infrastructure that holds it when you deploy it. They can have different pipelines that can be used to manage that deployment process and that hosting process. And they can have different things used for testing. There's all kinds of additional pieces that can kind of be added to each one of these layers, or even to manage the entire stack itself as one cohesive unit. And we are also not limited to one of each of these layers. These layers can exist parallel to each other, so we could have multiple databases that feed into the same API, multiple APIs that feed into the same front end, multiple front ends that feed off of the same API. It doesn't matter how many of each one of these things there are, but at some point in the process, this is kind of the modern architecture behind applications. And also, when I say applications, you might be thinking like phone apps, which is true. It is the same basic idea for phone apps. But what I'm also talking about is web applications. So things like YouTube or Facebook or any other website that has kind of stuff that you interact with and not just stuff that you look at. And that's kind of the distinction here between a website and a web app. But at any rate, with all of that said, let's dive in and talk a little bit about each one of these bullets. Now, I pulled all of this stuff up ahead of time instead of going bullet by bullet, so that we can kind of get a good overview of everything, because each one of these things kind of interacts with other things on this list. So starting from the top, we have the database. Now, the database is arguably the most important piece of any application, because the database is where we actually store the information that the application feeds off of. So it's where we store things like where to find this video in some cloud storage system, or what your username is, or what my username is, or the description under the video, or the title of the video. Like every individual piece of information that you see in a web application comes from the database and is stored in the database. So if you go in and write a comment, you're going to be creating a new record. You're going to be inserting a new record in the database. If you're viewing this video, then it's going to be getting some kind of information to lead you to this video out of the database. Stuff like the location of the video, the title, the description, all that stuff. And if I make a change to the title or the description or something, that would be updated in the database. And if I took this video down, it would be deleted from the database. So all of the actual stuff that is underlying an application so that it can function, so that we can persist data and store it for later, is happening in the database at the end of the day. Now, database has kind of grown to have more than one meaning. I've seen applications that are built with a database that was just files inside of a cloud storage bucket. So you could have just like JSON files. There's also NoSQL databases, which kind of take that one step further, where it's almost like files, but they're stored inside of some kind of more complex system, and that system can have stuff like indexes kind of added on top. And then there are actual SQL relational databases like MySQL and PostgreSQL, and then one level even higher is stuff like MS SQL Server and Oracle, where there is like an additional set of features built on top of a relational database. So that's the basic idea of the database. It's just where we store all of our information. It's where we can go and look at the data that underlies things. We can insert new records into those tables, or we can get data out of those tables, update them, delete them, and we can even have multiple tables that interact with each other to pull kind of cohesive data sets. Now, with all of that said, when we jump into the API, it's going to be a little bit different, because the API isn't persisting the data. The API is kind of like the middleman. So the API is able to connect to the database. So the API controller will probably have something that helps it to connect to the database, and the database is then going to feed data to the API, and then the API can take that data and pass it along to the front end, or vice versa. The API can take data from the front end and pass it along to update the database, or pass along a command to delete something from the database. Now in the API, we'll have something called a controller, which is like a cohesive unit. So we probably have, like in YouTube, we probably have something like a user controller, which would control how you log in. Then we'd have probably like a video controller where we manage the videos that you're viewing and the data about them. And then we might have like a comment controller where we manage the comments underneath of the video, and probably all types of even more complex logic. Now, I've never worked for YouTube. I don't know exactly how their API is set up. I'm just kind of spitballing here about how this could work and why it would be separated that way. And the way that the controllers are separated is kind of to match our database tables, and more specifically to match the model, which I know is my third bullet there. So the model is kind of what connects the table to everything else. But even more specific than the table, it really connects the data set. So you could get a data set that involves more than one table, or you could even have a summary data set that doesn't get every row out of a table, but kind of summarizes the things inside of it. So if you look at a specific video, you might see like the number of views. And if you look at a channel, you might see the number of subscribers. Now that is summary data. It's not pulling down the whole list of subscribers. It's just going to count how many rows there are in the subscriber table where the subscriber is subscribed to that channel. So it doesn't necessarily need to pull the whole table. It might just pull some summary data about a table. And also, that data is probably not stored in the channels table. It's probably stored in the subscribers table, right? So we're now combining data from other tables. So models aren't necessarily directly related to the table. They could be very similar and they could be directly related, but they don't have to be. What they do have to be connected to is the data set. So all of the features of the data set would be stored in that model so that the model knows what the structure is going to be as it passes data from the database to the front end and vice versa. Now in the middle there, the one that I skipped over was endpoints. So the endpoints kind of live on the controller and they define the logic that actually goes on. So inside of something like a video controller, we probably have a different endpoint for insert, get, update, and delete. And for each one of those endpoints, whatever I do, the front end is going to know, okay, send the signal to this endpoint. Now send the signal to that endpoint. The endpoint is like the address where the specific piece of logic lives. And with that, jumping right into front end, in the front end, we have things like services. Now, services are the name that we use in Angular, but we also have the exact same type of structure in something like a reducer in React. And it's the same basic idea where the service is used to connect the front end to the API. So the service is where we store that address for the API endpoint so that when we make a change, we know where to send that change to. So the service is what connects the front end to the API. It knows where to send your information. It knows when to do it. So if I edit my video, if I edit the title on my video, for instance, then it would probably reach out to some service in the front end that knows where to send edits for videos. And then that'll send it up to the API endpoint, which goes through the API controller to connect to the database, and then in the database, that change will actually take place. Now, the rest of this stuff I think is pretty straightforward, so I'm going to zip through it a little bit more quickly than we have with the rest of this. So in the front end, we also have models. Models in the front end are basically the same as they are in the API. Now, the model just kind of says what that data set is going to look like so that the front end knows how to treat those different data points and knows which data points are going to be available based on the model you're using. Then we have the template, which is just kind of the way that the page is presented. So the template is like the HTML and CSS. If you don't know what that means, it's totally fine. It's just what creates the structure of what you see on the page, of where the elements are on the page, how big they are, what fonts are used, if the text is centered, all of that good stuff is stored in the template. And then we have the component, which kind of connects the template back to the logic. It connects the template to the services, and it probably has its own logic inside of it for stuff that doesn't require access to a service. Stuff like what happens if you click on a different video link inside of this video's page, or what happens when you click on one of the buttons on this page, what happens if you click on the like or subscribe button. All of that logic takes place inside of the component, and sometimes the component then sends a signal out to the service, which sends the signal out to the API, which sends the signal out to the database, and the whole chain kind of completes itself to manage what actually happens in the end, which is to persist that you've subscribed to some channel, that you've left some comment, that you've decided to move to a different video, and this is what kind of leads into routing. So if you clicked on a different video on this page, then it's going to route you to that video's URL. And when you get to that URL, that's like the address where that video starts. And when you get to that URL, YouTube knows, okay, we need to send a signal through the service to go and get this video out of the database and the information about this video and where it lives. And to be clear, I would almost guarantee you that the video itself is not in the database. The video itself is probably stored somewhere in some cloud storage system and then retrieved from that address. But the address where the video lives is probably in the database, just because that's good database design. And the same thing would be true of pictures. Basically any large data like that, we'd try to keep out of the database, where the database would mostly just hold text that can lead us to those bigger chunks of information, like videos, pictures, and files. And what you might notice too about a route is that when you go from one video to the other, there's like this weird kind of string of text that doesn't really mean anything that's different on each individual video. Now that is a URL parameter, and that parameter is how the YouTube front-end component knows which video you're trying to access. So the URL at that route has a specific parameter, and you'll also notice that if you go to different pages, like to your profile or to a channel page, that there's other pieces of information between the name of the website, which is youtube.com, and the actual channel kind of weird string that's random that pops out. That kind of tells it, okay, this is a channel. Okay, this is a profile. Okay, this is your settings, and all of those different things. And I'm saying this all kind of in regard to YouTube because that's where you're probably watching this, but the same is true of every web application. So the same is true of Facebook, the same is true of TikTok, and everything that you kind of interact with on the internet is going to work in a very similar way. So this is just kind of a basic overview of all of that structure and the way that these three main pieces interact with each other. So I hope that helps you to understand the architecture behind applications, and if you're interested in diving deeper into any one of those layers, I do teach courses on each one of these layers, and you can check those out at my website at the link below if you're interested. And with that, I hope you have enjoyed watching this video. Thank you for watching.